All right. We're going to try and keep an eye on the waiting room as we kick on, everyone. So just excuse me if I need to pop my head over to the other screen to kind of get going, to let people in. So, but we are bang on time, 11:01 at the moment as far as where I am. It's bloody daylight savings across everywhere, so everyone's on different time zones at the moment. But we'll kick on. So I trust it's nice where everyone's dialing in from. So welcome back. Welcome back to everyone that has joined us for the previous two sessions. But this is the third and final session actually of our De-Risk Your Energy Future webinar series hosted by Deta Consulting. So welcome. And I hope everyone has been getting a bit out of these sessions. If you haven't seen all of them, the recordings are available. Just like we're recording this one. So feel free to send me a message after this and I'll definitely send you the recordings so you can look back over it or share it with your colleagues should you wish. All right, so let's kick along. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Just as far as the content, we've got 60 minutes of your time locked away. Thank you very much for giving that up. We're going to try and aim for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes or so of presentation time, and we'll allow 10 or so minutes for Q&A and wrap-ups at the end. Just for during the content's concerned, we just like to keep mics and cameras off just so we can keep focused on the content. But even now or later on in the sessions, please feel free to put your cameras on and open up your mics and have a chat. It's always good to see the friendly faces out there. And as far as chats and questions are concerned, if you can just populate them into the chat box. Cam's going to keep an eye on things. We're going to keep just consolidating them into the end. And again, we'll open up a bit of a Q&A session then. All right. So moving forward, who are we? So most people on the call know who I am. My name's Glenn Schultz. So I head up the business development function for Deta in Australia. So no need for me to keep introducing myself, but joining me today is a new face. Before we had Eugene, who is a Melbourne-based senior engineer. We've actually got Cameron Stanley joining us in now as well. Unfortunately, I still have to say he is a Victorian, but that's not too bad. He's a senior process engineer for Deta. He's also one of our top research engineers. He is, as I mentioned, Victorian. He's ex-RMIT University, where he's done various different projects, but more recently worked on Race for 2030 projects, where he looked at electrification, renewables to displace fossil fuel energy, and also focused on flexible demand control kind of arrangements for the NEM. So very well versed to be able to present today the technologies that we're going to discuss. So thanks a lot, Cam, for jumping in.
All good, thanks, mate.
All right, moving forward. Just waiting. Okay. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. We're not here to talk about us. I just want to point out that, our mission internally is the same as, most people on this call. Our mission is to remove as much CO2 out of Australia and New Zealand as possible. And our internal target is to remove about 2 million tonnes by 2030. That actually needs to, I think, be updated because I think we're going to hit that years in advance of that particular target, mainly because of the activity from industry that we're able to support that removal. So, it's fantastic that is actually the case, that we're actually seeing and we're putting out these targets and actually hitting them years in advance. And that, as I mentioned, means that industry is moving forward to decarbonize their processes, which is awesome. All right. We're going to just kick off with a little bit of a recap in case people didn't make the first couple of sessions. I've just picked out the main hot points, if you like, of those two sessions. We'll recover them, and then that will lead in nicely to the main part of this particular webinar. So the first point that we covered is that, there's still a little bit of uncertainty in the Australian NEM infrastructure, although we have more recently seen a lot more announcements about what we're going to do with about 16 gigawatts of power generation that needs to be considered over the next 2 decades. Specifically, more recently, the announcements out of Queensland, which I'll actually go into. I've got a slide on that. But there is definitely a lot more focus on transitioning the brown sort of coal power generation sites than ultimately patching up and replacing. So, which is obviously good. As far as pricing is concerned, we went into a bit of detail in webinar 1 about both the gas infrastructure pricing and the electrical pricing, and the fluctuations that we're seeing within them. I think we need to go to the point where the days of sub $10 a gigajoule for natural gas are certainly, they're gone. I've been only having recent conversation with clients about, waiting for the speed bump to end. Ultimately, things are going to return back to the happy days of sub 10. And I just don't think it's going to happen personally. We can refer to the ACCC netback pricing graphs. They're seeing things like spiking at $60 a gigajoule and returning back, somewhere around $30, $25 a gigajoule, mid-24 onwards. So I think whether it's $30 or it's $24 or it's $25, it's certainly not $10 a gigajoule on the natural gas side. And I'm not, I can't speak for everyone on the call, but I think we need to take that into consideration when we're thinking about our future investments, is, if that is the environment that we're going to continue to reside in, do those projects start stacking up economically better now if you're thinking about a $30 landscape as opposed to 10. We looked at Australia's opportunity to decarbonise in the first webinar as well. What we identified was about 350 odd petajoules of thermal heat energy that is ripe for decarbonisation today. And that is based on the current technologies that we have available. And we break that down into temperature zones. So anything kind of sub 200 degrees has the ability to decarbonise now. Anything above that, we have abilities for offsets. But when we get into the high temperature stuff, like in metal producing, those kind of areas, we're still waiting for a bit of technology to kind of catch up. But at the end of the day, for probably the majority in this room, we have alternatives, technology alternatives today that we can tap into. Various states and funding opportunities are available, namely New South Wales and Victoria for industry support. Queensland's lagging behind a little bit on that particular front. And we went into some of the, we broke it down into kind of the earlier stuff that generally doesn't take too much capital investment, but returns are, still modest kind of savings. So we've talked about the basics, which is all about kind of efficiency improvements, operational maturity, that kind of thing, where we can attain around about 5 to 1% in fuel savings if we kind of get those things right. Then moving forward into a little bit more capital investment territory, but still not major fuel switch, where we're talking about just general heat recovery opportunities. So they can be anything from a bit of recovery off air compressor systems, returning condensate, taking in flash steam, for example, and using it purposely in other areas, that kind of stuff. But in my experience, especially for most people around in this room, those kind of first stages are already mostly done, or you've at least been looking at them, or you've got a plan to look at them. It's when we get up into the more chunky kind of fuel switch options that there's still that need for a lot more engineering to go into place. And obviously we're talking about process technology alternatives as well. So, times where we're looking at processing assets that, have been in place for a long time. They might be coming to end of life. And there's that conversation around, what do we do with it? Are we just going to replace like for like, or is there another way that we can process our widget and pick up the energy savings at the same time? And we went through that a little bit. Electrification options. Obviously, there's a lot of influence around electrification, both from a state, federal, and influencing body point of view. But we went into that conversation about emission factors. It's all good and well to electrify. However, if we're still plugging it into a brown NEM, then as far as emissions are concerned, we're not moving the dial too much. So we went through emissions factors and explained the fact that if we are electrifying, substantial process heat, that we need to take into account that potentially it needs to be coupled in with a green PPA or some sort of renewable generation to hit the emissions reduction, across all of the emitting scopes. However, that is subject to change. And again, the Queensland announcements are kind of alluding to a lot more renewable infrastructure moving forward. And the fuel switching piece, more capital investment, better bang for buck as far as ROIs are concerned, but certainly the most impactful around emissions reduction. And we went through things like high temperature heat pumps, electrode boilers, biomass alternatives, and biogas generation. And we summarized that all into a, more of an application slide, if you like, where we've kind of considered those more food and beverage related applications and what particular technologies kind of make sense that we've seen in around our experience. Now, the caveat on this is obviously this is quite generic. Every site's quite different. We can't say that every single steam generating site's going to be equipped for an electrode boiler. There's obviously a lot more things we need to do in the process to reduce down that thermal load before we go in and put things like electrode boilers in, right? But it gives you a good guide if you're starting to think down this track on what technologies to consider for your process. And wrapping that all up into, the slide works, what a decarbonisation plan output should be. And really it's this capital investment pathway where we should see early on, or the early stages of the program being executed, where we start picking up that 1 to 5% fuel saving, lower capital costs, but just getting the efficiency right on the site, turning into, in the forward years where we're looking more at the heat recovery side of things, a little bit more capital investment. The ROI curve is going up, but the emissions reduction is coming down at the same time, until we get to a point where, ultimately there needs to be some skin in the game. There has to be a point in time where there's a big capital investment point, and that's obviously changes depending on what site is doing what. But at some point there has to be that fuel switch consideration if you're using already a fossil fuel heat generating source. And when that happens, there is that investment, but ultimately the emissions impact comes down quite considerably. And really at the end of a decarbonisation program, we should be seeing, especially with forward fuel costs, and potential carbon taxes on the horizon, right? We should be seeing these programs pay for themselves over the life of the project. And that's really what the bottom line of this investment pathway is that, yes, it takes some upfront capital, but ultimately the return should pay for itself moving forward. All right, so that summarizes the first two in a real quick nutshell. So there's a couple of hours of content rolled down into about 2 or 3 slides. So again, if we want to go into the detail of that, suggest just message me and I'll hand on the recordings. All right, so new federal targets. Interestingly, we started talking about this in webinar 1, where we talked about it being in the Senate waiting for approval. And obviously it is now that new climate target has been set into legislation. So what that is ultimately a doubling of the emission reduction targets over 2005 levels of the former government to 43% by 2030 and moving towards net zero by 2050. There's obviously been a nice big plug in the media about that actually getting through, which is fantastic. The first place to start, there's been announcements around, the controlling agencies from the government, taking these targets into account when setting new future budgets. We're still waiting for a little bit more formal policy around it. This is pretty fresh off the ranks, but there is already an investment strategy put out, which you can look into. But ultimately, it's talking about, all the areas that we would expect it to be, and 20 billion into the electricity grid. The influence is to electrify. There's no point doing that into a brown grid. So there's a lot more investment going into renewable electricity within the grid. 300 million into batteries, solar banks, 100 million into new energy and skills, apprenticeship supports. There's 500 million going into electrical fleet, that kind of thing. So high level numbers at the moment. The devil will be in the detail, but moving in the right direction. However, the other side of it is the Australian Climate Council. The CEO there, actually, Amanda McKinsey, she put out a reply to this saying, fantastic, really support it. However, there needs to be some change to the this current safeguard offsets program, which is ultimately about 170 odd of our largest emitters in Australia that can hit a safeguard offset position where they can continue on just basically emitting and paying a charge to continually emit into the atmosphere. So that ultimately is a call for change as well. All right, and also just a couple of things that's just recently come out is the New South Wales state government has released an EPA plan. It's in draft form at the moment, waiting for public opinion. But that is basically a plan that is, looking at multiple things, but at the end of it, it's about industry also reporting publicly actually their emissions, current emissions output, but also their reduction targets and what they're going to do about it. So a little bit more requirement probably down the line coming for industry to start at least reporting on their emission strategies, which is what you would expect when that kind of policy comes forward. All right, the next point is, as I mentioned, more or so over the latest 2 weeks, I think it's been, the Queensland renewable announcements. So Anastasia's put out this plan where she wants about 70% renewable infrastructure by 2032 and 80% before 2035, pending new elections. Sounds like a really nice thing to put out. She's talking about up to 62 billion in capital investment coming into the economy, but some of that being state and federally supported, but obviously others the overseas investment coming in and other areas. But she wants to do this by a whole series of different renewable kind of projects broken down into 3 different divisions: northern, central, and southern. So there's a bit going into pumped hydro. The Baroomba Dam's already there, but obviously there's a little bit of a community pullback on the Pioneer Burdekin hydro. So, again, it's all great to announce it, but she's got to get it across the line now. But a lot of solar, wind, battery, the general things you would expect to come through in this kind of plan. And again, making these reses, these kind of clean energy hubs that are going to be dedicated to big industry zones across the Queensland border. So that she's more focused on the infrastructure side than so much about the, support for industry directly. But as you'll see, there is a little bit of more support coming through with the latest announcement from ARENA. So I'm not sure if everyone's across this. I think this got released on the 30th of September, last Thursday. But basically, it's a funding announcement for all of industry within Australia, or manufacturing, I should say, within Australia, where there's now a $43 million funding grant available, or total grant obviously available, for feasibility engineering studies. So this is a really nice piece of funding. It's one of the first, it's the first that I know about where it's actually in direct support for industry to engage into deep feasibility engineering studies to implement some of these real needle dial moving technologies. So if you're not across it, again, contact me after, I'll share all the links. But basically what it's done is it's split into 2 streams. It's a 50-50 shared investment strategy. So for the end user and also for ARENA. So there's a whole, obviously, application process we've got to go through to get access to that. But stream A is the feasibility section, which is funding support up to 500K. So 100 to 500K for that piece of stream. And stream 2, which is is the engineering, the deep dive engineering studies between $250 and $5 million. So that's a really substantial piece of funding for some of these really big technology integrating pieces that is now able to support you guys to help get these things to business case ready. And that's really what it's about. It's not about doing a general canvas across the site and going, hey, there's an opportunity for, energy efficiency here or whatnot. And it's not even to actually support setting up full decarbonisation plans. What it is, it's very pointed to hone in on particular technologies, and some of the technologies are listed there. So And it's about getting those technologies business case ready for investment. So deep dive engineering studies, a lot of, integration kind of engineering design, getting those things to that position where, as a business, you can make the decision to move forward with it. So I think it's pretty exciting. I think they've got it pretty right as far as the technologies that they want to look at. And in fact, that's actually a really nice lead in to start handing over to Cam here, who's going to deep dive into some of those actually, who are already on this list. So I think that will support that quite nicely. So Cam, over to you, mate.
Kick off. All right. Thanks very much, Glenn. So as Glenn's just touched on, I don't know how much of a deep dive we'll get into given time constraints, but yeah, for the next 25 minutes or so, we're just going to have a bit of a look at some of those longer term technology options and considerations that perhaps weren't able to be covered in the first two webinars. So get your next slide. Yeah, so that we're talking here, maybe we'll cover off on solar thermal, what's termed super high temperature heat pumps. We'll look at some renewable diesel, I think biogas, is missing from the screen, hydrogen, and also most importantly, thermal energy storage. Next slide, please, Glenn. Okay, so first and foremost, solar thermal. As the first point here says, this is particularly relevant to Australia. So an interesting fact is that the solar energy that falls on 1% of Australia's land mass, or 75,000 square kilometres, is enough to provide Australia's total electricity needs 30 times over. So there's a lot of solar resource in Australia. Specifically, when we talk about solar thermal, it's quite a diverse field, and we can talk about technologies that are for heat production, but also for electricity production. So the efficiencies that we see from these systems are highly dependent on the nature of what we're talking about in terms of the application, but most importantly also around the kind of temperatures that we're trying to reach. Generally speaking, we can achieve efficiencies of, say, 3 times what solar PV can. So we're up above 55, 60% really in terms of efficiency. And looking at a parabolic trough style concentrating collector, so those can be producing above 250 degrees Celsius for process heating loads, you're probably talking around the $3,500 a kilowatt. For those large systems of, say, 50 megawatts capacity. In terms of the diversity of projects we've seen across Australia, most people are probably aware of the Sundrop Farms one, which was a central power tower style system over in South Australia there. Very interesting because it utilises not just the heat, it produces steam from that to make electricity. And as a byproduct, any waste heat is then put into the tomato growing greenhouses, as well as some desalination of the seawater. So it was a really interesting business case that really milked all the benefits of solar thermal and that location. But solar thermal can also produce things like hot water for use in absorption chillers to make cold demand. And there's also cases, for example, like the Di Bertoli winery in Griffith, where we're talking about using very basic technology, so just evacuated tubes, which are non-concentrating collectors, so quite simple. The same technology you'll see on domestic roofs for hot water production. They're being used in that situation as a preheat for a gas-fired ring main setup. So it's very diverse. And just recently, we've seen more attention come on to some of the concentrating solar power installations. You might have heard of either Vast Solar's projects that have been announced in Queensland, or also a Raygen collaboration with AGL for a project that will be looking to install a solar technology, concentrating solar PV technology at the Liddell power station when that shuts down. So some of these are becoming particularly important because of the inherent thermal storage capacity that solar thermal offers. Basically, they have the ability to store for many hours, depending on the exact installation. But just recently, the Australian Solar Research Institute has started an initiative called Solar at Night, and it's basically playing on the capacity for concentrating solar technology to store and produce baseload power and address the issues that the NEM is going to have with the intermittent renewables, particularly solar being unavailable in the daytime, solar PV. So this inherent thermal storage is what makes solar thermal technologies particularly important. And whilst we haven't necessarily seen any kind of major technology improvements with time in the last few years, what we have seen is the situation that they have to plug into, i.e. the NEM and the volatility around the PV generation, make, I guess, the business case for solar thermal increasingly strong. So that's why I think we're starting to see some of these now get announced. But in terms of process heating loads, they're a very viable option, and we can generate temperatures from anywhere below 100 degrees right the way through to, say, 300 or 400 degrees. So next slide, please, Glenn. Okay, so super high temperature heat pumps. We've put the super here in commas because the temperature classifications we use with heat pumps is very much application specific. So for certain industries, talking here of 150 to 200 degrees Celsius is not super, but it's in the context of what a typical heat pump might be able to produce. So really the holy grail for heat pumps is to be able to go right up to, say, almost 200. And just last year, a company out of Norway called Sintef produced, I think that's the name, Sintef, they produced a demonstration unit which claimed to be the world's hottest heat pump and is producing 180 degrees as an output. There's several other groups around that are chasing and also seeking this kind of thing, but at the moment, this is very much still in kind of the realms of R&D. There was a company in Norway called Viking Heat Engines that were producing a high temperature heat pump using an HFO refrigerant, and that was capable of producing 160 degrees steam. But the problem with these is it's just physics, and you need a high temperature heat source to be able to produce those kind of very high temperatures. So those kind of very high temperature heat pumps were needing temperatures of a waste stream that were, say, above 80 to 90 degrees Celsius. And the same will be the case for anything that's coming down the line. So I think it's important to kind of be aware that there will be heat pumps in the future that will be producing steam as an output and doing that up to potentially 200 degrees Celsius. However, I think it's just kind of important to remember that they're probably always going to require high temperature waste heat streams. And they need to kind of be evaluated in the context of the opportunity to use those waste heat streams for other loads in your plant or your factory. So we kind of anticipate that we might see some of these coming to market in the next, say, 3 to 4 years. But just recently, the Viking Heat Engines kind of, I think, went into insolvency, and I don't exactly know what status that company is at the moment. So I think it just points to the challenges of actually achieving some of these and being mindful of the maturity of the heat pumps that we have below 100 degrees is very much not the case when we're looking forward at what's coming. So, next slide. Okay, so biogas is obviously something I think that was touched on a little bit in some of the earlier workshops. There's quite an opportunity in Australia to expand on the production of biogas. Other countries around the world, Germany, for example, has more than 9,500 biogas plants. and they produce quite a significant amount of their domestic gas consumption from that. As we say there, Denmark can produce up to 50% of their gas demands from biogas production. In Australia, there's more than 270 biogas plants, but they're predominantly for waste treatment, for municipal waste and landfill. And often the problem is that the gas that's produced out of those at the moment is flared rather than being captured and used. And so these are the kind of opportunities that in Australia we really need to look at, capturing and doing something with that energy rather than necessarily just flaring it. So in terms of process heat opportunities and where this might present good opportunities, generally we're talking about industries that have significant organic waste streams already available. So meatworks, poultry, those kind of things, where they have large effluent streams. Also, water authorities are quite good at doing this already in Australia. So they have an opportunity to, instead of obviously paying for the treatment of that waste, to put it into an anaerobic digester, make natural gas from it, and then make biogas from it and supplement their natural gas consumption. So generally, I think it's important to be mindful of the limitations of perhaps around the quantities of biogas that can be produced. So some of the large meat works in Australia who already have these installations in place, they can kind of achieve 15 or 20% reductions in their natural gas consumption. But it always depends on the application and their need for that heat on site, whether they've got rendering, how much of their hot water production is coming from steam or gas-fired high-temperature hot water boilers, and are there opportunities to, say, perhaps reduce some of those loads, first and foremost, using things like high-temperature heat pumps, so that a biogas could then form a multi-pronged solution to that kind of problem. So yeah, there's an estimated biogas potential in Australia of 370 petajoules, which is quite enormous. And I think it's just a question of identifying which businesses and applications make sense for that, and in the context of all the other opportunities for a given site. Next slide, Ben. Okay, so hydrogen is obviously another one. There's lots of information, lots of talk about hydrogen. Obviously there's significant investment happening from the Australian government. There's now more than $1.2 billion of cumulative investment in both research as well as pilot plants for various projects and operations around Australia. So the issue is, I guess, around the chemistry and the fact that producing hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen, it requires a lot of energy, and that's obviously in the form of electricity. And to make green hydrogen, we need to have renewable electricity. So there's projections for what that means in terms of electricity production in the NEM. And we're talking about up to 50% growth in the amount of renewable electricity more that is required in the NEM to meet the kind of projections for hydrogen. So I think at the moment we can produce hydrogen around the $4 to $6 a kilogram mark. There are stretch targets for that to be brought down closer to the $2 a kilogram point. And it's really the cost of the renewables and the electrolysis itself that makes up the bulk of that challenge, with renewables accounting for about 50% of that. So I think in terms of why Australia is probably positioning itself like this, we obviously have the opportunity to capitalise on some of our natural resources, particularly being abundant solar, and the opportunity to make clean and cheap renewable electricity, which could then be exported. looking around our geographical region, we have countries such as Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea that are given ratings regarding their energy self-sufficiency that range between, say, 11 and 19%, whereas Australia has a rating in the same metrics there of more than 300%. So we have the ability to be very much a net exporter of energy. And I think it makes a lot of sense in that context that hydrogen is being explored. But in terms of hydrogen's use as a process heating tool, or even as a solution for businesses looking to decarbonise, I think it's very mindful that all the projections are showing that the kind of low cost, higher volume access to hydrogen is still very much 10 odd years or more away, and there's still some conjecture and question around the ability to hit that kind of price point of, say, $2 a kilogram, which would kind of bring it into context with, or kind of price parity thereabouts with natural gas. The other point is, I guess, to be careful that the hydrogen is truly green. It's funny, in some of the commentary we talk about the colourful language used to describe hydrogen, which is a transparent, odourless gas. So we talk about brown, grey, blue hydrogen, and obviously green. So green hydrogen is through the electrolysis and the breakup of water, and it has to rely on renewable electricity to be truly green. So I guess that's the point. If our electricity grid is to provide that kind of export quantity of hydrogen, then there is massive investment and significant expansion in the renewable capacity within the NEM that will be required, above and beyond that which is projected for just the electrification of industry. So as that point there's some question of whether or not there will be any efficiency improvement by using hydrogen versus just some of the direct electric solutions, which would be being unrolled, I guess, in the next decade or so. Next slide, Ben. Yeah, so I think this is the last on our list here of technology. Oh, no, sorry, renewable diesel. So we've got one more. Renewable diesel is similar to biodiesel in that they're both produced using feedstock that is either waste animal fats or vegetable oils, greases, and other kind of agriculturally derived waste products. However, the difference, I guess, in the two is their chemical process, and that biodiesel, the end result, without being an expert in biodiesel, is something that is not exactly the same as petroleum diesel and can only be spliced in for use at about a 5 to 20% mix ratio with petroleum diesel. Whereas renewable diesel is chemically identical to petroleum diesel and can be used as a direct substitute. So we're starting to see this being produced at quite large scale from Neste, largely out of Singapore, but they also have refineries in Finland and in Europe. And those products we're seeing, Air New Zealand has recently, for example, purchased some renewable aviation fuel for their fleet at about 3 times the cost of regular aviation fuel. So I guess the question is, with renewable diesel and renewable fuels, liquid fuels, I think it's fantastic and it's a great product. The fact that they can be used as a direct substitute helps quite a bit in terms of the necessary capex around swapping out plant to use that, or your transportation fleets, for example. But there's obviously a significant price premium for the final product. And the other thing is around those feedstocks which go into producing it. Given that they're coming, obviously the waste streams it's great to use that, but to reach the kind of scales and volumes they're talking about, producing those from dedicated agricultural crops and things such as algae, which can go into that production. And then it becomes a question of is there some competition for that land which is going towards this renewable diesel product or renewable liquid fuel product? And could that land be used better for something else, be that food production or dedicated growth of biomass, which can be in and of itself used as a direct fuel? So there will be, I kind of think, watch this space, and I see the liquid fuel thing as being an option, particularly for the aviation sector, which is particularly limited in terms of the options they have at their disposal. And I think probably for stationary fuels or heat sources, it's just not really gonna play a major role. Next slide, please, Glenn. Okay, so lastly, we'll talk about thermal energy storage, which is a really big and very important one. I'll just get you to click your slide one more time, Glenn, to bring that up. So as we say, it's not truly a renewable energy, but it's very much an enabling technology which helps with the integration of renewable energies into a site. So when we talk about thermal energy storage, we have low temperature thermal energy storage, which is very commonplace. You know, we talk domestic hot water systems, for example, are a big one. However, when we go to higher temperatures, we start to face more challenges, particularly when you're going over the magical 100 degrees point, where we can no longer use water as a sensible thermal storage medium. So there are many different types of thermal storage. We can be using sensible thermal storage, which stores the energy by the temperature increase in the material. We can use latent thermal storage, which is storing energy in the phase change of a material. And we can also get into some more complex electrochemical energy storage. So, I mean, I think as the example on the screen there is a product called the Energy Nest, which is being developed, storing heat in especially developed concrete, so it can store at quite high temperatures and produce steam. There also on the image earlier up in the slides was one from Graphite Energy, which is an energy storage solution being developed and commissioned for Mars Pet Foods in Wodonga. That facility is using a 3 megawatt battery capable of producing up to 900 degrees C, or the temperatures of thermal storage itself. And they'll be using that to produce steam directly for their processing facility. It can store and release energy during the day concurrently. So they're, I think, aiming to get 8 megawatt hours out of that over a 24-hour period, which is quite impressive. And I think we continue to see the development of this. So it's a moving field, and lots of more products hitting the market all the time. But just fundamentally down the bottom there, the reason why I put this slide up, even if you're looking at solutions such as high temperature heat pumps, which can meet those kind of sub 100 degrees Celsius loads, thermal storage and the appropriate integration of that can be a really important thing. And it's much cheaper to install thermal energy storage than it is to try to design a system to meet peak thermal loads. So if we do that well, we can be pulling the capacity of a heat pump down and using those periods of lower thermal demand in your process or your factory to charge that thermal storage, and then obviously discharge at other times when the instantaneous demand for heat exceeds what your heat pump can then produce. Which is really important when you think of the capex on something like a heat pump scales with the capacity of the unit itself. And you get the best results if you can be having that heat pump run 24 hours a day and still supply oscillations in your demand profile. So it's very important. Next slide, Glenn. So yeah, just quickly, I think this one's meant to be just showing a bit of a summary of which applications we can deliver with each of those different technologies. And as you can see, there's quite good coverage in terms of what's available now, and also some of those ones that are on the horizon. So I suppose this is building on the same kind of summary that was presented earlier for the existing technologies that were already presented on in the earlier webinars. And if you click it one more time, Glenn, I guess the question mark here, though, is that unknown economic and technical future. So some of these ones really are more bankable than others, and it's very much a horses for courses kind of argument. It very depends on your need and really needs to be assessed in that context of what's the commercial maturity of some of these solutions and how badly do you need them versus what's available right now as a mature available technology, and working through that in terms of a priority pathway for your individual business. So yeah, in summary, I think the consensus is that there is just no silver bullet in terms of decarbonising. It's not an easy process necessarily. And I think that's particularly true in Australia, where we have the challenges of that higher emissions factors for the electricity that we can access through the NEM. In New Zealand, the story is much easier. They've got clean electricity straight out of the plug, so it makes a lot of the electrified technologies that much easier in terms of a decarbonisation solution. However, some of them will be easier to install, require less capex or modification of processes, but then more expensive to run. Others are obviously cheaper to implement, but you have a higher risk of operation, or they're quite complex to operate, such as the solar thermal. Some of them also obviously have limitations around your space availability, which is a big one for solar thermal. But I think regardless of when you undertake your decarbonisation pathway and start investing, the best economic solution will always involve energy efficiency and trying to really pull down your demand first and foremost. It's around that hierarchy of let's really minimise the amount of energy you're using first before you then spend big money on trying to implement a clean solution. And I guess the last point there is just the best time to start is yesterday. So, just like out of guerrilla radio, what better time than now? What better place than here? So you just got to get stuck in and do it is our general attitude towards this.
Yeah, no, excellent, Cam. And I think that's a really good summary. This section is a hard one because we're talking about futuristic technologies that are, like you mentioned, all in R&D at the moment. Are they going to be, technologically the right solution is one point, but then feasibility, are they even going to be, at the right price point for them to make sense to be, brought into an Australian manufacturing infrastructure is the unknowns, right? And it kind of makes me lead into something I was thinking about. Is I get asked a lot of questions as well about, if you're a manufacturing plant, for example, and you are using steam or you need temperatures of that nature, we're talking about, huge amounts of fuss over heat pumps, and, we've obviously installed and managed quite a lot of heat pump projects over our time within Deta. But is it better just to wait for these super high temperature heat pumps to come forward, as opposed to investing in what we know is proven and actually working now, in your opinion? Or
yeah, it's a good question. I guess we do get that often from clients, when you put in front of them, say, a feasibility assessment, and that's the question that comes back, but they might have heard something in the news, but what about these high temperature heat pumps or the super high temperature ones? Should they just be holding off, and are they going to spend, big money on a solution now only to find that there's a newer, better model down the road? And I guess our take on that, or my take would be that no, you're probably best to just adopt what's here right now, particularly on those more risky ones that are still very much in their research and R&D phase, such as the high temperature ones. The technologies that are available at your disposal right now would be that CO2 heat pumps or ammonia heat pumps, particularly are almost just a no-brainer for those sub 100 degrees loads. They're bankable. There's millions of examples you could point to, particularly in Europe. I mean, we're a bit slower to get going in this area of the world, particularly Australia, given historical low energy prices and things. We're a bit late to the party. But I think the attitude would be get stuck in. And as we touched on, those higher temperature technologies are likely still going to need a waste heat stream that's, sub 100, but not far below. So, if there's things you can do now to offset your emissions using existing technology, I think that's the way to go, is get started and build some confidence.
Yeah. Like you say, there's plenty of case studies around the place that are showing, where it does work. I guess, we've got,
A question there from
actually, yeah, throw your mic on there and feel free to ask a question.
Yeah, good day all. Thanks a lot for this webinar. That was super interesting. I have two questions. One on the technical aspect. You did not mention geothermal energy. I'm not very aware how common it could be, or if it's something completely impossible in Australia, but I'd be happy to have your thought on that. And the second one is more on the business model and the financial aspects. What do you think about how business model can help developing this renewable technology? And I'm especially thinking about energy or heat as a service, as we can do with new heat.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, look, great question. Thanks for that. Firstly, on the geothermal one, I'm not by any way a geothermal expert. From my understanding, though, just given the geology of Australia, there is geothermal heat available, particularly out in the Moomba Basin in South Australia. And some of that, there was a lot of exploration works for geothermal power being produced from that. In terms of, I think that those projects kind of never went much past feasibility because, we're talking very, very deep reservoirs to try to hit that hot rock to produce, electricity. And without knowing every site and specific example, it's certainly not the case in Australia that we have kind of shallow, geothermal reserves that you could tap into particularly for process heat. So our focus would not be, I wouldn't be suggesting geothermal would be a good option for many sites or businesses in Australia. There may obviously be certain cases that it may be, but that would be my gut feel. Around the new models, I think the energy as a service is a fantastic idea, and I think it's really great that businesses like New Heat are in that market doing that. I think it's a great way that you can de-risk some of those technologies from a business and also take away some of the upfront capital load, so that you can enter into these long-term service contracts and purchase the desired product, which is the heat. I think it's good, and I think it would be great to see more of some of those, including things like refrigeration as a service, not just around heat as well. So,
yeah, thanks, Cam. Yeah, and obviously we've got this the ARENA funding also coming through as far as feasibility and engineering support to kind of look down this track of all different types of technologies as well. So, so there's that option, that support for industry at the moment to kind of really just flesh this out. And it's not just something that you can decide about right now, whether we're talking solar thermal or, electrode boilers and things like that. It takes a bit of a deep dive feasibility to even know if it's going to be integrated properly. And I would point out, just on the heat pump conversation, that is actually the key part. As we mentioned, we've been delivering heat pumps for a while now, because of the New Zealand context. And Australia is only starting to think about it. And what we've found over that time is the heat pump themselves is not, super technical as far as technology is concerned. It's the integration piece, right, Ken, that really takes the engineering and, understanding the production loads and where it can integrate and where you can store thermally any heat energy and then distribute it back out through the site. And that's where projects can go wrong, because you may not get exactly what the heat pump is actually quoting it can get out of, if we're not, haven't gone into the system design properly. Actually, Paul, yeah, thanks for your questions, Paul, in the chat there. Yeah, really good. So Paul wants to talk about a little bit more about solar thermal and thermal storage, which is also something of interest, right? Like, what is the best solution, really, given for this application. And I guess Paul's throwing a second question here, which we can answer together, I guess, is about, that large electrode boiler plus 30 megawatts of heat kind of thing. Like, our network is not geared up, not necessarily the network really, Paul. It's more it's the actual site transmission as well. It's actually set up to support these kind of thing. And I think that's a good question, Cam, as you got a bit of experience from over in NZ, because that is actually what's been happening over there, right? Those electrode boiler transitions. And maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. I'll do my best. I mean, I don't specifically have direct project experience with boilers of that size, Paul. But from my understanding from some of the other big dairy sites here is that are kind of well down the pathway for decarbonisation and really somewhat leading in terms of their commitments. They're the ones that have these kind of very large boilers. And as you say, integration and support from the network is a big challenge. One of the big projects we've been working on is working directly with the distribution companies around identifying these large boilers and understanding what their timeframes and desired pathways are for decarbonisation, so that they can work in partnership with those end users to ensure that the network can supply the power that they need. At 30 megawatts, often you're talking about dedicated feeders and almost always talking about upgrading, transformers and supply to site. So it's significant, and there is very large infrastructure costs associated with that. We're lucky over here in that some of that is being met through the New Zealand government funding. And I can't speak to whether there's opportunities for similar kind of CapEx contributions for those kind of grid upgrades in Australia at this point. The other consideration is around looking at the alternatives. So things such as biomass boilers. Almost predominantly the decision seems to swing at that kind of scale between wood pellets, wood chip, or electrode boiler. And sometimes you'll see a combination solution, and depending on what their existing boilers might be and the complexity and ability to retrofit with one of those biomass fuels. So yeah, it's something that's challenging, but yeah, happy to talk about the specifics of your application, if you'd like to afterwards. So
yeah, look, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, Paul, go.
Yep.
Yeah, look, and that's the thing. Like, I've been 3 sessions. Thanks, guys. That just, generally speaking, been fantastic. And I will cover, probably follow up with you guys at some stage specific to our site. We're a large scale dairy manufacturer, Saputo, down in Victoria, and
Yep.
And yeah, 30 megs. Most of our sites have maxed out at about 10 meg of power grid supply to the sites across all our sites, and the feedback from PowerCore, who are a distributor, is that their network can probably offer us another 2-3 at a cost of a couple $1 million to us per site. But when we're talking about 30 plus megawatts per site of it's not even in the ballpark. I just there's more of I just don't see where the federal government are going to come to the party in this, because PowerCore are basically saying, as a distributor, we don't have the funds. We don't, no one has the funds basically unless the government comes in here and chips in to sort of do these things. I'm just not sure how in 10 years from now we're ever going to achieve this sort of level, triple the power, basically what we have right now. Even with infrastructure upgrades, unless the federal government sort of chip in substantial millions and millions of dollars to do this. Anyway, maybe it's just a pessimist opinion of where it's going.
No, for sure, Paul. I guess the thing that I've seen, I guess from the successes over in New Zealand, where they are a bit further ahead, is that those first couple of stages, 30 megawatt direct replacement right now, like you say, is just not feasible. But if we can halve that, because we've done smart things around the process, some heat pump integration, does that start making a little bit more sense? And I don't think that silver bullet's not there, right? It'd be great if we could all plug in 30 meg and we'd cover pretty much most of the food and beverage industry. That would be done, but it's not gonna. I think it has to be a combination of all of those things before we go to that big fuel switch piece.
Yep. Yeah. No, thanks, guys. Like I said, I'll follow up at some stage after this presentation with you both. Thank you.
Go on, Paul. Cheers.
No worries. Thanks, Paul.
Well, that's kind of the end of the questions in the chat, and we are coming bang on to time. Look, the last thing I'd just finish on is, again, thanking everyone for joining in, especially everyone who's joined into 3 series. What's next? If you want to reach out to us, we're here. Certainly myself, we're spread across Australia and New Zealand, as I say. We do all of the things that we've been talking about in this, and we can obviously support with the arena funding actions as well. So, I won't go into a plug about who we are, but look, just understand that we're across Australia and New Zealand. We've been doing this for a long time now. And there's a lot of this stuff that's only just starting to be spoken about in Australia. And we've been already implementing it and doing the engineering studies to support it. So happy to chat. Thank you so much for coming along and enjoying the webinar series with us. Let me get you back your day, and look forward to chatting to you soon.